Joe McKinney hadn't cried in 11 years. Not when he buried his son. Not when he burned the boys' clothes so he wouldn't have to look at them anymore. But standing in the doorway of that broken-down cabin, watching a 7-year-old girl press a torn blanket against a baby who wouldn't stop shaking something cracked open in his chest that no amount of whiskey or hard work had ever touched. If this story moves you, friends, subscribe to this channel. Drop your city in the comments and ride with me till the very last word. Joe McKinney didn't hire Samuel Hart because he felt sorry for the man. He hired him because the fence along the south pasture had been rotting since April, and his regular hand, a wiry kid named Dylan, had up and married a school teacher in Billings and moved east without so much as a goodbye. Joe didn't blame him. He'd have left this valley too if he were 22 and still believed in things like futures. Sam Hart had shown up at the ranch gate on a Tuesday morning, hat in hand, spine crooked from age or injury or both, squinting against the summer sun like it had personally wronged him. He was maybe 65, maybe older, the kind of man whose face told years the way tree rings told weather. "I heard you need fence work done," Sam said. Joe looked him over from the porch. He didn't move from his chair. "You heard right. I can do it. I'm slower than I used to be, but I'm thorough." "How thorough?" "You won't find a post I set that'll lean before 5 years." Joe said nothing for a long moment. He picked up his coffee mug, found it empty, set it back down. "$1 a day. You bring your own tools." Sam nodded. "Yes, sir." "Don't call me sir. Name's Joe." "Yes, sir, Joe." That was how it began. Simple as that. A broken fence and a broken-down man, and the kind of agreement that required no paperwork and no trust beyond what could be tested with a good strong push on a fence post. Joe didn't ask where Sam lived. He didn't ask if he had family. He'd spent 11 years carefully not asking people questions because questions invited answers, and answers invited conversations, and conversations had a way of turning into something that required him to feel things he'd long since decided weren't worth feeling. Sam came every morning at sunup. He worked until the heat became cruel, took a 30-minute rest in the shade of the big cottonwood by the water tank, then worked again until the light turned gold and long. He never complained. He never asked for more water than what was in his canteen. He ate whatever he'd brought from home, usually a biscuit wrapped in cloth and something that might have been dried meat, and he ate it alone, sitting on the ground, looking out across Joe's land with an expression that wasn't envy and wasn't longing. It was something quieter than that. Joe watched him from a distance. He told himself he was keeping an eye on the work quality. That was all. By the end of the first week, Sam had set 14 posts and strung more wire than Joe had expected. The work was good. Better than good. It was the work of a man who understood that the only dignity left to him was in what his hands could still do. Joe paid him on Friday afternoon. $6. Exact. Sam folded the bills carefully and tucked them into the inside pocket of his vest. "Thank you," he said. "You earned it," Joe said. He meant it as a dismissal. Sam seemed to understand that too, because he picked up his tools and started walking down the road without another word. Joe watched him go. There was something in the way the old man walked, not slow exactly, but deliberate. Like a man who knew that wherever he was going, he had to get there with enough left in him to still be useful when he arrived. It irritated Joe in a way he couldn't name. The second week, Joe began to notice things he hadn't noticed before. Sam arrived 20 minutes later on Monday than he had the previous week. His knuckles were wrapped in strips of old cloth. The limp in his left leg was more pronounced. He said nothing about any of it. Joe said nothing either. He brought an extra mug of coffee out to the porch that morning and set it on the railing without comment. Sam looked at it, looked at Joe, and then walked over and took it with both wrapped hands. "Joints acting up?" Joe asked. He hadn't planned to ask. "Little bit," Sam said. "Hot weather makes it worse before it makes it better." Joe went back inside. On Wednesday, Sam arrived with a bruise along his left jaw that had turned from purple to the sick yellow-green of an old wound healing wrong. Joe noticed it at noon when Sam came to fill his canteen at the pump. He didn't ask. He'd decided he wasn't going to ask. He asked anyway. "What happened to your face?" Sam touched his jaw, not defensively, more like he'd forgotten it was there. "Tripped on something in the dark." "The dark. I get up early." "What time?" "4 most mornings. Baby's up by then." Joe's hand stopped on the pump handle. "You've got a baby." Sam looked at him with an expression that was neither pride nor shame, just the plain flat face of a man stating a fact he'd long since made peace with. "I've got several children, Joe." Joe stared at him. "Several?" 11 at the moment. Though Rachel says it might be 12 by end of summer if the Beaumont girl doesn't find somewhere else to go. Joe didn't say anything for so long that a hawk circling overhead had time to make 2 full passes before he found his voice. "You've got 11 children." "Yes." "You and your wife?" "My wife Rachel, yes." "How old are they?" Sam tilted his head slightly like a man running numbers. "Youngest is 4 months. Oldest just turned 16. Everything in between." He paused. "None of them are mine by blood. Before you ask." Joe hadn't been about to ask that. Or maybe he had been. He wasn't sure anymore. "Then whose are they?" Sam looked out across the fence line he'd been working. The posts stood straight and clean in the summer heat. "Theirs," he said simply. "They belong to themselves. We just make sure they have somewhere to belong while they figure that out." Joe looked at him for a long time. The hawk made a 3rd pass. Then Joe turned away and went back to the house without another word, because he didn't have one. That night, he sat on his porch until well past midnight. He had a good house, 4 rooms, a kitchen with a proper stove, a bedroom that was too big for one man and had been for 11 years. He had 1,200 acres of good Montana grazing land, a herd that was healthy, a well that had never gone dry, and more money in the Helena Bank than he would ever be able to spend on his own. He thought about a 4-month-old baby waking up at 4 in the morning in a house with 11 children and 2 elderly people who were using torn cloth as bandages because they couldn't afford the proper kind. He thought about the $1 a day he was paying a man with wrapped-up knuckles and a bruised jaw to set fence posts in the July heat. He didn't sleep. Thursday morning, he rode out early. He told himself he was checking the eastern pasture. He was not checking the eastern pasture. He was following the road that Sam Hart walked every morning for 2 miles before the sun was fully up, and he was following it all the way to where it bent left past the old Miller property and continued another 1/4 mile into the trees. The cabin sat in a clearing that had probably been pretty once when someone had cared for it. The roof had been patched in at least 3 places with different materials. The front porch railing was missing 2 posts. A kitchen garden ran along the south wall, not decorative but dense and serious. The kind of garden planted by people who understood that what came up from the ground was the difference between eating and not eating. Beans, squash, tomatoes that were just starting to blush red, potatoes mounded in careful rows. He heard them before he saw them. Children's voices. Not playing, not laughing, working. The steady sound of small bodies doing the morning chores that had to be done before the heat made everything harder. The thunk of wood being split. The complaint of a hand pump. The low musical humming of a girl old enough to carry a tune. And underneath all of it, the thin, reedy cry of an infant. Joe sat on his horse at the edge of the tree line for a long time. He wasn't sure what he'd expected. Something smaller, maybe. Something more manageable. What he was looking at was a world, a complete, complicated, exhausted, somehow still functioning world balanced on the frame of 2 elderly people and held together by nothing more than whatever Sam Hart's thorough fence post work could earn him in a week. He turned his horse around and rode back without anyone seeing him, or so he thought. "You came by this morning." Sam said Friday afternoon when Joe handed him his pay. Joe didn't flinch. He'd decided years ago that flinching was a luxury. I was checking the east pasture. The east pasture is north of my place.
This
Joe
story
looked
was
at him.
posted on the channel
You've got
west
good
of
eyes for a
Betrayal.
man your age.
Please do not repost
I've got a
it in any
16-year-old
form.
girl with better ones, Sam said. She saw you from the loft window, told me after breakfast. He folded his money the same careful way he always did. You could have come in. I didn't want to intrude. You're not the intruding kind, Joe. You're the standing at the edge of things kind. He said it without any heat, just observation. Rachel made extra cornbread this morning. There usually isn't any left by midday, but she put some aside. Said if you came by the cabin, you should have it. Joe said nothing. She does that, Sam said. Puts things aside for people before they know they need it. He settled his hat back on his head. You should come by sometime. The children would like to meet the man who pays for their flour. He walked away down the road. Joe stood there with $6 fewer in his pocket and something new and unwelcome sitting in the center of his chest. He didn't go to the cabin that evening. He went on Saturday. Rachel Hart opened the door before he had a chance to knock. She was a small woman, compact and precise the way a woman gets when she's spent decades fitting herself into whatever space is left over after everyone else's needs have been met. Her hair was silver white, and her eyes were the sharp, clear gray of creek water in October, and the first thing she said to him was, not hello or good morning or what brings you here, but, you look like a man who hasn't eaten a real meal in a while. Come in. Ma'am, I'm not... Joseph McKinney, she said. I know who you are. I've known who you are since before Samuel took your work. I know about your ranch, and I know about your losses, and I know you've been feeding yourself on coffee and regret for longer than is good for a person. Come in. He came in. The inside of the cabin was chaos and warmth in equal measure. 3 children he counted wrong. The first time came back to 5 were at the long table with slates and chalk, scratching out sums under the supervision of the 16-year-old girl, who looked up at Joe with the cool measuring eyes of someone 3 times her age. A boy of maybe 12 was mending a harness in the corner with the focused expression of a craftsman. 2 little ones, 4 or 5 years old, were playing some kind of complicated game on the floor that involved a jar of buttons and a set of rules only they understood. And in Rachel Hart's arms, nested against her chest, like a small animal that had found the one safe place in the world, was the infant. 4 months old, dark-haired, asleep with the absolute commitment that only babies and the very certain manage. Eli, Rachel said, and the 12-year-old looked up from the harness. Come say hello to Mr. McKinney. The boy set the harness down with deliberate care and crossed the room. He was dark-eyed and narrow-faced with the particular wariness of a child who had learned early that adults came and went, and that the ones who stayed longest weren't always the ones worth keeping. He looked Joe up and down with an assessment that would have been impressive in a grown man. You're the rancher, Eli said. I am, Joe said. Sam says you don't waste words. I try not to. Eli considered this. That's all right, he said finally. We've got enough people here who talk too much. He looked pointedly at one of the children at the table, a red-haired girl of about 9, who was currently whispering something to the girl beside her while the 16-year-old pretended not to notice. Then Eli went back to his harness. Rachel put a plate in front of Joe before he'd even sat down. Cornbread, a thick slice of ham and beans cooked with something that smelled like sage and onion. He ate it because refusing it would have been insulting, and because she was right, he hadn't eaten a real meal in longer than he wanted to admit. He didn't say much, neither did Rachel, but she refilled his coffee twice without asking, and at some point the children at the table forgot he was there and went back to their sums and their quarrels and their private games, and the 16-year-old whose name was Clara brought him the cornbread he'd apparently been set aside from the morning, wrapped in a clean cloth, for the ride back. He was almost to the door when Eli looked up again. You coming back? The boy asked. Joe stopped. He thought of all the correct answers to that question. all the measured, careful, self-protective answers that 11 years of solitary living had trained him to give. "I expect I might," he said. Eli nodded once like a man satisfied with a contract. Joe rode home in the late afternoon heat with a piece of cornbread in his saddlebag, and something sharp and quiet working its way through the walls he'd spent a decade building one careful crack at a time. He didn't know yet what it was going to cost him. He didn't know that by the time summer was over, it was going to cost him everything he'd been holding on to. And it was going to be worth it. Joe went back on Monday. He told himself it was because he needed to discuss the fence schedule with Sam directly, rather than waiting for the man to walk 2 miles to the ranch at sunup. That was the reason. A practical reason. The kind of reason a practical man gave himself when he didn't want to examine the real one too closely. He brought flour, 50 pounds of it loaded across his saddle without ceremony. When Rachel opened the door and saw it, she didn't gasp or flutter or make a fuss. She just looked at the sack, looked at Joe, and stepped aside to let him in. "Put it by the stove," she said. He did. Eli was at the table eating breakfast. He looked up at Joe, then at the flour, then back at Joe. "That's a lot of biscuits," the boy said. "It's a start," Joe said. Something shifted in Eli's expression. Not warmth exactly that would come later, and it would cost them both something to get there, but a loosening. The faintest relaxation of that permanent watchful tension around the boy's eyes. He went back to his breakfast without another word, and Joe sat down across from him, and Rachel put coffee in front of him without asking. And that was Monday. He came back Wednesday. He brought salt pork and 2 bolts of cotton cloth, because he'd noticed on Saturday that 3 of the younger children were wearing clothes that had been mended so many times, the original fabric was almost a memory. Rachel took the cloth with both hands and held it the way a woman holds something she'd stopped letting herself want. "You don't have to keep doing this," she said. "I know," Joe said. "Sam's wages are fair. We manage." "I know you manage." He picked up his coffee. "I'm not saying you don't." Rachel looked at him for a long moment. Then she folded the cloth carefully over the back of a chair and went back to the stove. "Clara's been teaching the little ones their letters in the evenings," she said like she was offering him something in return. "She's got a gift for it. Patience I never had at 16. "Where'd she come from?" Joe asked. He wasn't sure why he asked. The question came out before the part of his brain that had learned to be careful could stop it. Rachel didn't answer right away. She stirred whatever was in the pot. Then she said, "She came from a wagon that didn't make it through the pass 2 winters ago. She was the only one who did." She paused. She walked into town alone, 14 years old, frost-bitten fingers on both hands. The hotel wouldn't take her in without money. The church was locked. Another pause. Samuel found her sitting on the steps of the Mercantile at midnight. Joe said nothing. He looked at his coffee. "That's how most of them came," Rachel said quietly. "Not in ways people planned. Just they showed up and we didn't look the other way." Joe put his mug down with more care than was necessary. "You could've," he said. "Looked the other way. Most people do." "Yes," Rachel said. "Most people do." The trouble started on a Thursday, the way trouble in small towns almost always does, quietly, in a place where men spoke freely because they believed no one who mattered was listening. Joe had ridden into Harlan Creek to settle his account at the Mercantile and buy seed he didn't particularly need yet. He was at the counter when he heard his name from the back of the store spoken by a voice that belonged to Douglas Crane, who owned the livery stable and had an opinion about everything that happened within a 10-mile radius of town. "McKinney's gone soft," Crane was saying to whoever was with him. "Heard he's been hauling supplies out to that old Hart place regular. Flour cloth, Lord knows what else." "Charity work," another voice said. "Younger." Joe didn't place it. "Call it what you want. Man like McKinney spending his time and money on a couple of old squatters with a cabin full of somebody else's children, that's not charity. That's a man who's lost his way." Crane paused. Or lost his mind. After what happened to his boy, I reckon some people
This
just...
story was posted
Joe
on
set
the
his money
channel
on the
west
counter
of
loud
Betrayal.
enough to stop the
Please
sentence
do not
cold.
repost it
He
in
didn't
any
go to the
form.
back of the store. He didn't need to. He picked up his goods, nodded to the clerk, and walked out. His hands were steady. His jaw was not. He sat on his horse outside the mercantile for a full minute without moving. After what happened to his boy. 11 years. 11 years, and the town of Harlan Creek still carried the story of Daniel McKinney like a stone in its pocket to be pulled out and used whenever it wanted to explain something about Joe that made people uncomfortable. His grief, his silence, the way he didn't come to church and didn't come to socials and kept his 1,200 acres between himself and everything that might reach him. He rode straight to the Hart cabin. He didn't plan to. His horse just went there. Sam was on the porch when Joe arrived. He was sharpening a blade with long, even strokes, not looking up until Joe had dismounted and tied his horse. "You've got that look," Sam said. "What look?" "The one that means someone in town said something about your past, and you're deciding whether to be angry or be hurt." Sam ran his thumb along the blade's edge, checking it. "Which is it?" Joe leaned against the porch rail. "Crane's talking." "Crane's always talking," Sam said. "Man hasn't had an original thought since 1871. He brought up Daniel." Sam went still, just for a moment. Then he set the blade down across his knee. "I'm sorry," he said. And the thing about Sam Hart was that when he said something like that, he meant every syllable of it, without decoration, without performance. Just the plain weight of a man who understood what loss felt like and wasn't going to pretend otherwise. Joe looked out across the yard. Somewhere inside the cabin, a child was laughing at something. High and bright and completely unaware of everything that existed outside that moment of being 7 years old and finding something funny. "How old was he?" Sam asked. Joe hadn't talked about Daniel in years. He'd learned that talking about him made people uncomfortable, which then made Joe responsible for managing their discomfort, which meant he ended up taking care of everyone else's feelings about his own grief. He'd decided it was easier to just not. But Sam wasn't asking the way people usually asked. He wasn't asking with that particular mixture of sympathy and curiosity that was really just nosiness wearing a kind face. He was asking the way one man asks another when he already knows part of the answer and is willing to sit with the rest of it. 6, Joe said. He was 6. Sam nodded. He didn't say anything else. He didn't say he was sorry again, or that time heals all wounds, or that Daniel was in a better place. He just picked up his blade and continued sharpening it with those long, even strokes, and let Joe stand there in the particular silence of a man who'd just said something true for the first time in a long while. After a while, Joe said, "What was her name?" "The Beaumont girl Rachel mentioned." "Anna," Sam said. 12 years old. Father's dead. Mother ran off with a cattle drover back in April. She's been sleeping in the Beaumont barn alone for 2 months. He paused. Rachel went to see her last week. Said she had one dress and half a blanket and was pretending she was fine. Joe thought about that. "She coming here?" Rachel already told her she could. Sam glanced up. "We'll make it work. We always make it work." He said it without bravado, without drama. Just the simple, worn confidence of a man who'd made impossible things work too many times to doubt himself about it anymore. "You're going to run out of floor space," Joe said. "We've been running out of floor space since the third one arrived." Sam almost smiled. "Turns out children don't actually need as much room as you think if they've got enough of everything else." Joe was halfway back to the ranch when Warren Kent's buggy nearly ran him off the road. Kent pulled his horse up sharp, and for a moment, the two men just looked at each other across 5 feet of summer dust. Warren Kent was 53 years old, wore his vest like armor, and had been the primary lender for half the properties in Harlan Creek for 15 years. He had the particular confidence of a man who had learned that money was the closest thing to authority that didn't require anyone to actually respect you. McKinney, Kent said. Kent. Funny running into you. Kent's smile was the kind that made rooms colder. I was just thinking about you. I doubt that's true, Joe said. What do you want? Kent adjusted his grip on the reins. I hear you've been spending considerable time out at the Hart property. I have. And considerable money. My money, Joe said. Mine to spend. Of course. Kent's tone didn't change. I only mention it because I have a professional interest in that property. Samuel Hart has been behind on the terms of his land use agreement with my bank for the better part of a year. I've been patient out of respect for his age and situation. But patience has limits. Joe felt something cold move through him that had nothing to do with the heat. What kind of agreement? A private arrangement, Kent said smoothly. Not one I'm at liberty to discuss in detail. But I'll tell you this: McKinney man to man that cabin and the acre it sits on isn't as securely Sam Hart's as perhaps he's led you to believe. There are legal dimensions to that property that could become very complicated very quickly if the right pressure were applied. He let that sit for a moment. I'd hate for your generosity to be wasted on something that turns out to be unstable. Joe looked at him for a long time. Is that a threat, Kent? It's information, Kent said pleasantly, freely given neighbor to neighbor. He clicked his tongue at his horse. Good afternoon, McKinney. He drove on. Joe sat on his horse and watched him go, and the cold feeling didn't leave. It settled in deeper, finding the space between his ribs where the morning's conversation with Sam had briefly made room for something warmer. He turned his horse around and went back to the cabin. Sam was still on the porch. He looked up when Joe came back, and something in his face changed. Not surprise, more like a man who had been waiting for a particular piece of news and was now watching it arrive. Kent, Joe said. It wasn't a question. Sam set down his blade. How much did he tell you? Enough to know there's more. Joe tied his horse again and sat down on the porch step. Talk to me, Sam. Sam was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, 5 years ago, when Rachel and I first started taking the children in, we needed to make the cabin larger, add a room. Rachel was we already had 4 at that point, and more were coming, and the original structure was too small. He paused. I went to Kent for a loan. He offered one. The terms seemed manageable at the time. What were the terms? $30 a year. Against the property title. Sam's voice was flat, informational, like he was reading from a document he'd memorized long ago. I've kept up with it most years. Last year, Rachel was sick for 2 months in the winter, and I couldn't work. We fell behind. He looked at his hands. I paid half of what I owed come spring. Kent accepted it. Said we'd settle the rest at the end of summer. He paused again. He didn't put that in writing. Joe absorbed this. How much do you owe him? Sam told him. It wasn't a large number in the context of Joe's finances. It was an enormous number in the context of Sam Hart's. And Joe understood suddenly, with the particular clarity that comes from seeing several separate things line up into one true picture, that Warren Kent had not accepted that partial payment out of patience or neighborly goodwill. He'd accepted it because a man who owed you money was a man you had leverage over, and leverage over Sam Hart meant leverage over 11 children and the roof above their heads, and Kent was the kind of man who collected leverage the way other men collected land. He's going to use those children to get something he wants, Joe said. Sam didn't deny it. That's my read. What does he want? Sam looked at him steadily. I think, he said slowly, that he wants your south pasture. I think he's been wanting it for 3 years. And I think that if he can make my situation uncomfortable enough and make it known around town that the arrangement out here is irregular, he's counting on you to pay him off just to make the problem go away. Sam's jaw tightened. And then he'll own something he got through a back door, and none of it will have cost him a cent of genuine effort. Joe said nothing. I should have told you sooner, Sam said. I didn't, Because it felt like I didn't want you to think that was why I took your work, or why Rachel made you coffee. I didn't want you to think we were using you. Were you? No. Sam met his eyes. But I
This
knew the
story was
situation
posted on the
existed,
channel
and I let you
west
get
of
fond of this
Betrayal.
place without telling
Please
you
do
the
not
full of it,
repost it
and that's
in any
close
form.
enough to dishonest that it's been sitting on me. He picked up the blade, set it down again. I'm sorry for that. Joe looked at him for a long time. The heat of the afternoon pressed down on everything, and from inside the cabin came the sound of Rachel's voice, low and steady, talking one of the younger children through something, a lesson, or a fear, or both. The sound of her was the sound of patient, unrelenting love applied to small crises, and Joe sat with it for a moment before he answered. Sam, he said, how long have you and Rachel been doing this, taking them in? 12 years, Sam said. Since before this land had that cabin on it. Since before we had anywhere to put them. We started with 2 in a rented room in town and just... He almost smiled. Just kept going. 12 years, Joe repeated. With no help. With neighbors' help some years. Less in others. And nobody in Harlan Creek thought to make sure Kent couldn't just pull the ground out from under you. People in Harlan Creek, Sam said carefully, generally feel good about the children being taken care of as long as it's us doing it and not them. It's a comfortable feeling from a comfortable distance. He paused. You're the first person who's ever come close enough to see what it actually takes. Joe stood up. He was quiet for a moment, working something out inside himself that didn't have words yet just direction. The same feeling he'd had as a young man when he'd ridden out to claim his first piece of land, that forward-leaning certainty that preceded action that moment before you commit to something irrevocable. Don't worry about Kent, he said. Sam looked up at him sharply. Joe. I said don't worry about him. He untied his horse. I'm going to pay him a visit. It's not your debt. Joe put his foot in the stirrup and swung up. He looked down at Sam Hart, this thorough, deliberate, quietly extraordinary man sitting on a porch that shouldn't still be standing, and somehow was. You want to know something? Sam, I've had 1,200 acres and enough money to live 3 lifetimes, and I haven't done one thing in 11 years that mattered a damn to anyone but myself. He settled in the saddle. I reckon it's time to change that. Sam opened his mouth. Joe rode before he could finish the argument. Behind him, the cabin door opened, and Eli stepped onto the porch. The boy watched Joe's horse disappear down the road, then looked at Sam. Where's he going? Eli asked. Sam picked up his blade, resumed his long, even strokes. To do something foolish, he said. That might turn out to be the bravest thing either of us has ever seen. Eli watched the road for another moment. Then he sat down next to Sam on the porch step. Good, the boy said quietly, and said nothing else. Warren Kent's office smelled like money and old paper, and the particular kind of confidence that comes from never having been told no by anyone who mattered. Joe walked in without knocking. Kent looked up from his desk. His expression moved through surprise irritation and careful neutrality. In about 3 seconds, the face of a man who'd practiced managing unexpected arrivals. McKinney, he said. I didn't expect you so soon. I reckon you didn't. Joe pulled a chair from against the wall, set it in front of the desk, and sat down without being invited. How much does Sam Hart owe you? Kent folded his hands. I told you that's a private. How much? A pause. Then Kent named the figure. Same one Sam had told him. At least he wasn't inflating it yet. Joe reached into his coat and set an envelope on the desk. That's the full amount plus 6 months forward. Consider the Hart account settled. Kent didn't touch the envelope. He looked at it the way a man looks at something that has just complicated a plan he'd considered finished. That's generous of you, he said slowly. It's not generous, Joe said. It's a transaction. You'll write me a receipt, you'll mark the account cleared, and you'll have no further claim on that property or the people in it. I'm not sure. Kent. Joe leaned forward, just slightly, just enough. I know what you want. You've wanted my south pasture for 3 years, and you thought you'd found a way to put enough pressure on me that I'd sell it to make a problem disappear. That's not going to happen. The pasture isn't for sale, not to you, not for any price." He held the man's gaze. "But this debt is real, and I'm paying it. And when I walk out of here, I want that account zeroed, and I want your word for whatever it's worth that you'll leave that family alone." Kent's jaw tightened. "You're making an enemy." "I've had enemies," Joe said. "They're less trouble than regret." He stood. "Write the receipt." Kent wrote it. Joe walked out of that office with the receipt in his pocket and the particular hollow feeling of a man who has done the right thing and knows it will not be the end of the problem. Because men like Kent didn't abandon plans. They redirected them. And Joe had just made himself the primary obstacle, which meant he'd also made himself the primary target. He was counting on that. He didn't go back to the cabin that day. He went home, sat at his kitchen table, and wrote 3 letters, one to his lawyer in Helena, one to the county land office, and one to a man named Frank Aldous, who had been Joe's closest friend before Daniel died, and the friendship had quietly drowned in the same grief that had taken everything else. The letter to Frank was the hardest. It was 4 sentences long, and it said, "I need you. Come when you can. There are children involved. I'll explain when you get here." He sealed it and wrote it to the post office himself. Then he went home and slept better than he had in 11 years. He wasn't sure what that meant. He suspected it meant that doing something real, something that cost him something and required something of him, beyond just endurance, was the first honest rest he'd allowed himself since the morning he'd stood at a small grave in the July heat and told himself he didn't deserve to feel anything anymore. Sam found out what Joe had done on Sunday morning. Joe had not told him. Rachel had not told him. Clara had overheard Joe mention the receipt to Rachel in the kitchen on Saturday, when Joe had stopped in briefly, and Clara had told Eli, and Eli, who was 12 years old, and had the information management instincts of someone 3 times, that had decided Sam should know from Joe directly, and had therefore told Sam himself in that blunt, efficient way the boy had, that Joe had paid Warren Kent off. Sam arrived at Joe's ranch at 7 in the morning, with a look on his face that was not gratitude. It was closer to the look of a man who has just discovered that someone has moved his furniture without asking, aware that it was done with good intentions, unsettled by it nonetheless. "You should have asked me first," Sam said from the porch step. Joe was drinking coffee. He handed Sam a mug. "You would have said no." "That's correct. I would have said no." Sam took the coffee but didn't drink it. "That was my debt, Joe, mine to manage." "You were managing it toward losing your home." "Maybe." Sam's jaw worked. "But it was my home to lose, my decision to make." "And those 11 children had no vote in it," Joe said quietly. That landed. Sam felt it land. Joe watched it happen, the slight tightening around the older man's eyes, the way his grip shifted on the mug, the breath he took that was half argument and half acknowledgement. "That's not fair," Sam said. "No," Joe agreed. "It isn't. But it's true." A long silence. A crow made noise somewhere in the distance and then thought better of it. "I don't want charity," Sam said. His voice was lower now. Not angry. Something older than angry. Something that sounded like a man who had swallowed his pride so many times it had left a permanent mark on the way down. "I've spent 12 years making sure those children never felt like charity cases. Never felt like burdens. If I start taking handouts—" "It's not a handout," Joe said. "It's what neighbors do." "You're not my neighbor. You're a wealthy rancher who's been alone on 1,200 acres for 11 years, eating bad food and talking to his horse," Joe said with a bluntness that surprised them both. "Sam, I'm not doing this because I pity you. I'm doing it because it's the first thing I've wanted to do in longer than I can rightly remember." He set down his mug. "Don't take that from me." Sam looked at him for a long time. Then he drank his coffee. He didn't say thank you. He didn't need to. What he said instead was, Rachel
This
wants
story
you
was
for Sunday
posted on the
supper.
channel west
She's making
of
a
Betrayal.
roast.
Please do not
Tell her
repost
I'll be
it
there,
in any form.
Joe said. Sam nodded. Started down the porch steps. Stopped. Without turning around, he said, He was a good boy. Daniel. I heard he was a good boy. Joe's throat closed for a single moment. Then he opened again. He was the best thing I ever had a hand in, he said. Sam walked back to the road without another word, and Joe stood on his porch and watched him go, and felt the particular complicated mixture of grief and something approaching peace that had become the emotional weather of this strange summer. The town meeting was Warren Kent's idea. It was called for the following Wednesday evening at the community hall, and it was framed through whatever whisper network Kent operated in as a discussion about the welfare of the children at the Hart property. Concerns had been raised, it was said. Questions about living conditions. Questions about legality. Questions about whether 11 children, some of them adolescents, some of them young men and women nearly grown, could be considered properly looked after by two elderly people with no formal standing as guardians and no oversight from any county authority. Joe heard about it from the blacksmith on Tuesday. He went home and read his lawyer's response, which had arrived that morning, and which confirmed what he'd suspected, that in the state of Montana, in the summer of 1887, the legal framework for informal guardianship of orphaned children was loose enough to drive a wagon through, and that anyone with enough money and enough motivation could use that looseness as a weapon. He went to the cabin Tuesday evening. Clara met him at the door. She looked at his face and said, "You know about the meeting?" "I know," he said. "Rachel's upset," Clara said quietly. "She's not showing it, but she is. She's been baking since this morning, which is what she does when she's frightened and doesn't want to be." Joe stepped inside. The cabin smelled like bread and something sweet, a pie maybe, or cobbler. Rachel was at the stove with her back to him. The younger children were already in bed. Eli was at the table awake, with an expression that was 2 parts fury and 1 part the kind of helpless fear that an angry 12-year-old will do almost anything to hide. Sam was in his chair by the window, and he looked up when Joe came in with the face of a man who has been waiting for whatever is coming and has decided he's ready for it. "They're going to try to take them," Joe said. He didn't soften it. There was no version of this conversation that soft edges helped. Rachel's stirring slowed. Stopped. She didn't turn around. "They're going to say the arrangement is improper," Joe continued. "They're going to say there are no legal documents, no county registration, no formal process, all of which is true. And then they're going to say that the welfare of the children requires intervention, and Kent will be sitting in the front row looking like a concerned citizen." "What does he get out of it?" Clara asked. She was standing at the doorway to the back room, arms crossed, voice controlled. The voice of a girl who'd been cold on a mercantile stoop at midnight and had learned to keep her fear behind her teeth where it couldn't be used against her. "Reputation," Joe said. "And pressure. If he can make this place look precarious enough, make Sam and Rachel look like they can't manage, then he's created enough doubt that I look like a fool for defending it. And a man who looks like a fool tends to make different decisions about his pasture land." Eli slammed his palm on the table. Not loud, but hard. "So, this is about your pasture," he said. And his voice cracked on the last word in the way 12-year-old voices do when the emotion is bigger than the instrument. "No," Joe said. "It isn't. Not to me." He looked at the boy directly. "Eli, look at me." The boy looked. Joe held his gaze. "This is not going to happen. You understand me. Nobody is taking anyone out of this house. I need you to believe that." "Why should I?" Eli's voice was raw. "People always say things like that. They say it, and then they leave, and then things happen anyway. And nobody—" He stopped, pressed his lips together. His eyes were bright and furious. "I've been left before," he said. Lots of times. By people who meant it when they said it too. The room was very quiet. Joe crossed to the table and sat down across from Eli. He didn't speak for a moment. He thought about Daniel. He thought about what it meant to promise a child something in a world that had demonstrated repeatedly that promises broke. He thought about what it cost a man to say something irrevocable and then live up to it for the rest of his life. I know, Joe said, and I can't prove to you right now that I'm different from those people. The only way I can prove that is to still be here when this is over. He paused. But I'm going to that meeting tomorrow night. And I'm going to stand up in that room, and I'm going to make it very clear that this family has someone who won't be moved. He looked at Eli steadily. And after that, you can decide what you think of me. Eli stared at him. His jaw was tight. His eyes were still bright. Then slowly some of the rigid anger in his shoulders came down by a fraction, not gone, not surrendered, but shifted. Recalculated. He didn't say anything. He just nodded once barely, and went to bed. Rachel finally turned from the stove. Her eyes were dry, but only barely, and she looked at Joe with an expression he couldn't fully translate, something between gratitude and grief, and the complicated feeling of a woman who has spent 12 years protecting everyone else and has just for a moment let someone else hold the weight. Stay for supper, she said. Yes, ma'am, Joe said. The community hall in Harlan Creek held maybe 100 people at capacity. On Wednesday evening, it held approximately 60, which was more than enough for Warren Kent's purposes, and more than enough to make Joe's stomach tighten when he walked in and felt the collective attention of the room land on him like weather. Kent was at the front as expected. Elder Thomas sat beside him, looking uncomfortable in the way of a man who knows he's being used as respectability furniture and has decided the social cost of refusing is higher than the moral cost of participating. Douglas Crane was there. 3 other men Joe recognized as Kent's creatures, men who owed him money or favors, or both, sat in the second row. Sam and Rachel had not come. Joe had told them not to. Not because he wanted to fight their battle without them, but because Rachel needed to be with the children tonight, and Sam needed to be with Rachel, and what was going to happen in this room was a thing that Joe needed to do with his own voice, in his own name, without the complication of watching 2 elderly people sit through an attack on their life's work. Clara had wanted to come. Joe had told her no, and she'd argued with a precision and clarity that would have impressed a lawyer, and he'd said no again, and she'd said fine, with the tone of someone who meant absolutely the opposite of fine, and he'd respected her for it. Joe sat in the 3rd row. He didn't sit in the back where a man who was uncertain of himself would sit. He didn't sit in the front where a man who wanted to dominate would sit. He sat in the 3rd row in the center where a man who intends to be heard sits when he is ready to be heard. Kent called the meeting to order. He spoke for 10 minutes about community responsibility, the welfare of children, the importance of proper documentation, the county's duty to ensure that informal arrangements met basic standards of oversight. He was smooth. He was measured. He invoked the children's well-being in every 3rd sentence, and every time he did it, Joe felt something tighten behind his sternum. Then Kent opened the floor. 3 men spoke before Joe. Each of them expressed concern. Each of them used words like proper channels and appropriate oversight and county standards. Each of them glanced at Kent between sentences like dogs checking in with the hand that held the food. Joe stood up. The room shifted. He felt it, the particular recalibration that happens when a room understands that what comes next will not be more of the same. I've been listening, Joe said, and what I'm hearing is a lot of concern about legal documentation from men who didn't say a word when the Beaumont girl was sleeping alone in a barn for 2 months. He looked around the room. Nobody met his eyes for long. I'm hearing concern about oversight from men who walked past that cabin on the Miller Road for 12 years and never once stopped to ask if Sam and Rachel Hart needed anything. He paused. And I'm hearing concern about the welfare of those children from a man who held a debt over an elderly couple's heads and called it patience. The room went very still. Kent's expression didn't change, but his eyes did. "Those children are fed," Joe said. "They're clothed and taught and
This
spoken to
story
with
was
dignity,
posted on the
and
channel
they
west
sleep under a
of
roof
Betrayal.
that two people
Please
built
do
with
not
their own
repost it
hands
in any
and their
form.
own sacrifice, and 12 years of getting up every morning and choosing to keep going." His voice was steady. It surprised him. What they don't have, what they've never had, is someone standing up in a room like this and saying out loud that what Samuel and Rachel Hart have built is worth protecting, that it matters, that it counts. He turned and looked at Kent directly. "So that's what I'm doing." A beat of silence. Then Kent said smoothly, "That's a very moving speech, McKinney, but moving speeches don't satisfy county documentation requirements." "No," Joe agreed. "They don't." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded document. "But this does." He held it up. "A formal petition to the county registrar supported by my attorney in Helena, requesting official recognition of the Hart household as a registered family home under the charitable provisions of the Montana Territory Code, filed this morning." He looked at Kent. "Which means any attempt to challenge the arrangement on legal grounds goes through the county office, and then through my lawyer, and then through a process that will take considerably longer than you've planned for." The room exhaled, not dramatically, but audibly. Kent stared at him. For the first time since Joe had walked into that office 2 days ago, something moved behind the banker's careful eyes that was not calculation. It was the plain, undecorated look of a man who has realized he has miscalculated the nature of his opponent. "Furthermore," Joe said, and he let the word land before he continued, "I intend to formalize my own involvement with the Hart household. As of this week, I am covering the cost of any necessary repairs or expansions to the property. I am supplementing the household's income for as long as Sam Hart wishes to work for me, and I am prepared to be named as a supporting party in any legal documentation the county requires." He folded the paper back into his coat. "So, if there are further concerns about that family's stability, I suggest those concerns be directed to me." He sat down. The room did not erupt. It didn't need to. What happened was quieter and more complete than eruption. A collective understanding moving person to person, like water finding its level that the ground had shifted. Douglas Crane cleared his throat. Elder Thomas found something interesting to examine in his hat. The men in the second row looked at Kent, who was looking at Joe with an expression that had moved all the way past calculation into something that was for the first time simply personal. "The meeting," Kent said carefully, "will be continued at a later date." He closed his folder. He did not look at Joe again. Joe walked out of this community hall into the warm July night and stood on the boardwalk and breathed. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt something quieter and more structural, the feeling of a load-bearing wall that has just been tested and has held. The feeling of a man who has taken a position and discovered to his own surprise that his legs are steady under him. He was halfway to his horse when he heard boots on the boardwalk behind him. He turned. It was Frank Aldis. Standing there, with a travel bag over his shoulder and trail dust on his coat, and the same crooked, weathered face Joe had last seen at Daniel's graveside 11 years ago, when neither of them had known what to say to the other, and the silence had grown and hardened into the kind of distance that looks permanent until something breaks through it. "Got your letter," Frank said. Joe stared at him. "That was 4 days ago." "I rode fast." Frank looked at him steadily. "You said there were children involved." He looked past Joe toward the hall. "What did I miss?" Joe turned back toward his horse. "Come with me," he said. "I'll explain on the way." "On the way where?" "To meet the people worth meeting," Joe said. And for the first time that night, for the first time in longer than he could calculate, he felt something that might eventually, with enough tending, become something close to hope. Frank Aldis had not changed in 11 years in the ways that mattered. He was still the kind of man who listened more than he talked, who asked the right question at the wrong moment and the wrong question at exactly the right time, and who had the particular quality of stillness that made other people feel in his presence that whatever they were carrying was safe to set down temporarily. Joe had forgotten that about him. Or maybe he hadn't forgotten it. Maybe he'd just made himself stop reaching for it the way you stop reaching for a thing you've decided you can't have anymore. He explained the hearts on the ride out. All of it. Sam and the fence posts and the flower and the children and Warren Kent and the meeting. Frank listened without interrupting, which was how Joe knew he was taking it seriously. When Joe finished, Frank was quiet for a moment. Then he said, 11 children. 12 now. Anna Beaumont came last week. Frank absorbed this. And you paid the debt. I did. And filed the legal petition. This morning. And stood up in a room full of Kent's people and said your piece. Yes. Frank nodded slowly. He looked at the road ahead. Joe, he said, who are you right now? Because the man I knew 11 years ago wouldn't have done a single one of those things. Joe thought about it. It was a fair question. I'm not sure yet, he said honestly. But I think I'm becoming someone I don't mind being. Frank looked at him, then a long sideways look with the particular quality of a man who has grieved alongside you and knows the specific texture of what recovery looks like from that close, and said nothing more. Just nodded once and rode on. Rachel opened the door before they reached the porch. She looked at Frank with the swift, accurate assessment she applied to everything, and then she looked at Joe, and whatever she saw in both of them must have satisfied something in her, because she stepped back and said, "There's enough supper left. Come in, both of you." Sam was still up. He looked at Frank, then at Joe, and something moved across his face that was not quite a smile, but was the architecture that smiles are made from. "You have a friend," he said to Joe. "Apparently," Joe said. "First one he's mentioned," Rachel said from the kitchen. "Rachel," Joe said. "It's true, and you know it," she said pleasantly. Frank sat down at the table, and within 4 minutes he was talking to Sam with the ease of two men who have never met but recognize each other. The particular recognition of people who have both in their separate lives understood what it means to keep going, when keeping going is the hardest available option. Frank had lost his wife 6 years ago. He'd told Joe in a letter brief and factual the way men of that generation reported pain. Joe had written back 3 sentences and then not written again for 2 years, and the shame of that had been part of what made reaching out now feel like climbing something steep. Clara came out of the back room to get water and stopped when she saw Frank. She looked at Joe. "This is Frank Aldis," Joe said. "He's going to help us." Clara looked at Frank. Frank looked back at her with the straightforward respect he gave to anyone who had clearly survived something regardless of age. "That's a serious face for 16, he said. "That's a long ride for a man who got a 4-sentence letter," Clara said. Frank almost smiled. "Fair point." He looked at Joe. "I like her." "She's terrifying," Joe said. "Go to bed, Clara." Clara went to bed with the expression of someone who was going, but wasn't going to forget any of what she'd heard. They stayed until nearly midnight. When Joe and Frank finally rode back toward the ranch, the summer dark was warm and full of cricket noise, and Joe felt something he hadn't felt in 11 years of Montana nights, the particular sensation of a day that had mattered. "Kent isn't done," Frank said. It wasn't a question. "No," Joe said. "He isn't. The legal petition buys time. It doesn't end it." "I know." "What's the play then?" Joe had been turning this over since he'd walked out of the community hall. Not just the legal angle. Frank was right that the petition was a wall, not a solution, but the deeper structural problem, which was that the Hart household existed in a state of permanent precarity that Warren Kent had simply been the latest to exploit. The problem wasn't Kent. Kent was a symptom. The problem was that 2 elderly people and 12 children were living in a patched roof cabin on the goodwill of a man who could die or leave or simply run out of capacity, and when that happened, the whole thing could come apart inside of a season. I want to make it permanent, Joe said. Frank glanced at him. Define permanent. Deeded land. Proper title. Something that can't be threatened with a debt or a banker or a town meeting. Joe kept his eyes on the road.
This story was posted on
The
the
Miller
channel
property
west of
adjacent to the
Betrayal.
Harts is
Please
abandoned.
do not repost
Has
it
been
in
for
any
4
form.
years. I want to buy it, add it to the Hart acreage, and deed the whole thing to Sam and Rachel outright. No liens, no agreements, just their land. Frank was quiet. That's a significant sum. Yes. Sam will argue about it. He will. What are you going to tell him? Joe thought of what Sam had said on the porch, about the children belonging to themselves, about just making sure they had somewhere to belong while they figured that out. I'm going to tell him, Joe said, that those children deserve a place that exists past us, past all of us, something that's still standing when they're grown and gone and have children of their own, who need somewhere to come back to. Frank said nothing for a long while. Then, you've thought about this a lot. I haven't slept particularly well this summer, Joe said. No, Frank said with a tone that meant something different than the words. I don't suppose you have. He told Sam on Friday morning. He did it at the ranch over coffee without preamble, the way he'd learned to say hard things to Sam directly with enough respect to skip the softening that the man didn't want, and would see through anyway. Sam set his mug down very carefully. No, he said. Hear the whole of it first. I don't need to hear the whole of it. The answer is no. Sam, Joseph McKinney. Sam's voice was quiet and completely firm. I have accepted your wages because I earned them. I accepted the debt payment because I was in no position to argue without those children paying the price for my pride. But I will not accept you purchasing land and signing it over to me like I'm a charity ward. I won't. He picked up his mug again, set it down again without drinking. There are things a man has to hold for himself, or he isn't holding anything at all. Joe looked at him for a long moment. What if it wasn't charity? What else would it be? A partnership, Joe said. Formal, documented. You run the household, I provide the capital. The land is held jointly under both our names with the legal provision that in the event of my death or incapacity, it transfers fully to your household. Sam blinked, just once. That's not a partnership. That's charity dressed in different clothes. It's what I'd offer any man whose operation I believed in, Joe said. If I thought Sam Hart's orphan house was a bad investment, I wouldn't be sitting here. He leaned forward. Sam, what you and Rachel have built, it works. It has worked for 12 years with nothing. Imagine what it does with something solid under it. Sam was quiet. He looked at his hands, turned them over once the way a man does when he's trying to read something in his own palms. Rachel would say yes, he said finally. I know, Joe said. She'd say yes because she thinks about the children first and her pride second, which is the right order, and I know it's the right order, and it still takes me a moment every time. Sam picked up the mug a third time, and this time actually drank from it. You'd want it in writing. My lawyer can have documents in 2 weeks. I want a separate clause, Sam said. That says the children who've come through that house, all of them, the ones there now, and the ones who come after, have the legal right to call it home for as long as they need. Not just while Rachel and I are alive. After. Joe looked at him. You've thought about this too. I've thought about nothing else for 12 years, Sam said. I just never had the means to make it real. He set down the mug, looked at Joe with a directness that carried weight. You're sure about this? I've never been more sure of anything since I picked the land for my own ranch. Sam extended his hand across the table. Joe took it. They shook once firmly the way men sealed things that mattered, and neither of them said anything else for a while. The first complication arrived on Monday in the form of Douglas Crane. Joe was at the Mercantile when Crane came in and positioned himself near the counter with the deliberate casualness of a man who has rehearsed being accidentally nearby. McKinney, he said. Hear you've been busy. Most people are, Joe said. Buying up the Miller parcel, I hear. Crane kept his voice conversational. Friendly even. Big investment for a piece of land that's been sitting idle. Land doesn't stay idle forever. No. Crane picked up a tin from the shelf, looked at it, put it back. Word is you're planning to tie it to the Hart property. Make the whole thing one parcel. He glanced over. That would make it the largest private holding in this part of the county outside of your own ranch. Arithmetic's correct, Joe said. Kent's not happy about it. Kent's happiness isn't something I track, Joe said. Crane's friendly manner slipped, just slightly, just enough to show what was underneath. You've made a powerful man into an enemy, Joe. I'm saying that as someone who has no particular interest in either side. You're saying it as someone who owes Warren Kent $1,400 against his livery, Joe said pleasantly. Crane went still. I know exactly whose side you're on, Douglas, and I appreciate you letting me know where things stand. He picked up his goods and headed for the door. You tell Kent that the Miller parcel closes at the end of the month, and that if he's got a legal objection, he should file it with the county office, where it will sit for 6 months before it's reviewed. He paused at the door. Good day. He walked out. His hands were shaking slightly. He didn't let it show until he was mounted and moving. The second complication was Rachel, not Rachel herself. Rachel was a constant, steady presence, the fixed point that the entire household orbited around, unshakable and certain. The complication was what Clara told Joe on Tuesday afternoon when she rode out to the ranch alone on the old gray mare that had been Sam's before the mare decided she preferred Clara. Rachel hasn't been well, Clara said without build-up. Joe looked up from the fence post he'd been inspecting. Define not well. She's been tired, more than usual, and she had a coughing spell last night that woke 3 of the little ones. Clara's voice was measured, controlled, the voice she used when she was most frightened. Sam doesn't know I'm telling you this. Does Sam know how bad it is? Sam knows she's tired. He doesn't know about the blood. The air changed. Or maybe it didn't change, and Joe only felt it change because the word landed somewhere behind his ribs and did not move. How long? He said. I noticed it first maybe 3 weeks ago. She said it was nothing. She said she was fine. Clara looked at her hands on the mare's reins. She always says she's fine. That's how you know she isn't. Joe put down the fence post. I'm going to send Frank to Helena for a doctor. Today. She'll refuse to see one. Then I'll tell her the doctor is coming to look at one of the children, and she'll sit still long enough for me to make sure she's examined. He looked at Clara. You did right coming to me. Clara nodded. She didn't look relieved. She looked like a 16-year-old who had been carrying this alone for 3 weeks and was only now allowing herself to feel how heavy it had been. Is she going to be all right? She asked. Joe looked at her steadily. He thought about what it meant to promise something true to a person who had learned that promises break. I don't know, he said, but she's going to have a doctor, and she's going to have everything she needs, and she's not going to face it alone. That much I can promise. Clara pressed her lips together, nodded again, and rode back without another word. Joe went to find Frank before the dust had settled. Prompt. Frank left for Helena that afternoon. He was back with a doctor by Thursday, a man named Aldrich who had the compact, unhurried manner of someone accustomed to delivering news that required sitting down first. Rachel sat through the examination with the resigned dignity of a woman who had correctly diagnosed the situation before the doctor arrived and had simply been waiting for everyone else to catch up. Sam sat outside the closed door with his hands on his knees and a face that Joe had never seen on him before. All the careful steadiness gone, replaced by the plain, unguarded fear of a man confronting the possibility of losing the person without whom none of the rest of it makes sense. Joe sat beside him. He didn't say anything. He didn't try to manage it or soften it or fill the silence with anything except his presence. He just sat there the way Sam had sat with him on the porch when Joe had said Daniel's name out loud for the first time in years, and he let the weight be shared without trying to lift it entirely. The doctor came out after 30 minutes. He spoke quietly. Not the news of emergency, but not the news of nothing either. A condition of the lungs manageable with rest and medicine,
This
and a
story
winter
was
somewhere
posted
less
on the
harsh
channel
than
west of
Montana.
Betrayal. Please do not
Serious,
repost
not
it in any
immediately
form.
fatal, requiring attention and care, and the kind of sustained support that two elderly people running a household of 12 children could not provide alone. Sam listened to all of it. He thanked the doctor with his usual plain courtesy. Then he sat back down and put his face in his hands briefly for just a moment, in the way a strong man allows himself 1 second of the feeling before he picks it back up again, and then he straightened and looked at Joe. "I can't do this without her," Sam said. It wasn't a dramatic statement. It was a simple fact, stated with the clarity of a man who has just confirmed something he already knew. "You won't have to," Joe said. "Joe, Sam." Joe's voice was quiet, but there was nothing soft in it. "Stop. I am not going anywhere. Frank is not going anywhere. And Rachel Hart is not going anywhere if the best doctor in Helena and everything else available to me can prevent it." He held Sam's gaze. "You've been keeping that house alive for 12 years on nothing. Let me help you keep it alive with something. That's all I'm asking." Sam looked at him for a long time. His eyes were wet. He didn't blink to clear them. He just let them be wet and looked at Joe with the full, undefended face of a man who has finally, after a long time, allowed himself to be held up by something other than his own will. "All right," Sam said. Those 2 words cost him everything and nothing. Joe understood that. He nodded once and looked away to give Sam the privacy of the moment, and inside the cabin he could hear Rachel's voice clear and dry, and completely characteristic of her saying something sharp to Dr. Aldrich about the proposed medication that made the doctor laugh in spite of himself. Joe allowed himself a small private smile. She was already arguing. She would be all right. What happened on Friday was something none of them had anticipated. Joe was at the land office, finalizing the paperwork on the Miller parcel, when the clerk, a young man named Patterson, with ink-stained fingers and an anxious quality that suggested he'd been recently threatened by someone with more authority than him, pushed the documents across the desk, with a look that said more than his words did. "There's been a filing," Patterson said quietly, "against the transfer." Joe went still. "What kind of filing?" Patterson glanced at the door, then back at Joe. "Formal challenge to title, filed yesterday afternoon." He lowered his voice further. "Mr. McKinney, it's not Kent." "Then who?" Patterson slid a second document across the desk. Joe looked at the name on it. He read it twice. Then he sat down in the chair beside the counter, because the name on that document was not Warren Kent's name, and it was not any name that belonged in this town or this story. And yet, it was there in clean black ink, challenging his right to purchase the land adjacent to the Hart property, and attached to it was a claim that Joe had not anticipated in any version of this summer that he'd been running through his mind. The name on the document belonged to a man Joe had believed was dead. A man who, if he was not dead, complicated everything: the land, the children, the formal partnership with Sam, and the careful legal architecture that Joe had spent 3 weeks constructing to keep 12 children safe. He put the document down on the clerk's counter. He picked it up again. "When was this filed?" he said. "Yesterday at 4 o'clock, Patterson said. "I'm sorry, Mr. McKinney. I thought you should know before who filed it for him." "He filed it himself." Patterson's voice was almost a whisper now. "He was in this office in person. I saw him." Joe looked at the name one more time. Then he folded the document, put it in his coat, stood up and walked out of the land office into the July heat. He stood on the boardwalk for a long moment. Then he went to find Sam. Because whatever this was, whatever this man's presence in Harlan Creek meant, whatever claim he intended to press, and whatever damage he intended to do, Sam Hart deserved to know before it reached his door. And it was going to reach his door. Joe was certain of that now. The only question was whether they would be ready when it did. The name on the document was Robert Calder. Joe said it out loud to Sam, standing in the Hart kitchen with the folded paper between them on the table, and watched the color leave the older man's face in a way that told him everything he needed to know, that this name was not a stranger's name, and that whatever history it carried had been sitting in Sam Hart's chest for a long time, waiting for exactly this kind of moment to surface. Rachel came in from the back room and stopped when she saw their faces. She looked at the paper, then at Sam. "Tell me," she said. Sam looked at his hands. "Robert Calder is Martha Doyle's brother," he said. "The children's uncle." The room went very quiet. Joe looked at him. "Martha Doyle." "Their mother. She died 4 years ago. Fever took her in 2 weeks." Sam's voice was flat and careful, the voice of a man recounting something he has had to make peace with in stages. "Before she died, she asked Rachel and me to take the children. She had no one else. Her husband was long gone dead, or run off, nobody knew which. Her brother Robert had left for California 10 years before and hadn't written in 7. Sam paused. "We looked for him. We sent word through 3 different channels. Nothing came back. Until now," Joe said. "Until now." Sam looked up. "What does he want?" Joe set the document on the table. "The filing is a title challenge on the Miller parcel. He's claiming that any land adjacent to or connected with property housing his sister's children falls under his right to review as next of kin." He paused. "It's a thin legal argument. My lawyer will probably shred it in a week. But it's enough to stall the purchase, and stalling the purchase means the land stays unprotected long enough for Kent to." "Kent is involved," Rachel said. "Not a question." "I don't know how deep," Joe said honestly. "But Robert Calder walking into the Harlan Creek land office 4 days after I file a purchase petition and challenging it on grounds that require local knowledge to construct, that's not coincidence." Sam stood up. He moved to the window and stood there with his back to them, and Joe recognized the particular quality of that stillness. The stillness of a man who is not calm but is choosing to be, because the alternative costs people he loves something they can't afford. "He has a legal right to see them," Sam said. "The children, if he's who he says he is." "He does," Joe said. "I won't pretend otherwise." "Then we let him come." Sam turned around. His face had settled into something resolute. "We don't hide from it. We don't run from it. He comes, he sees what we've built, and then we see what kind of man he is." Rachel nodded once. The kind of nod that meant she'd already arrived at the same answer and had just been waiting for Sam to say it out loud. "I'll arrange a meeting," Joe said. Robert Calder was 51 years old and looked like a man who had spent most of those years outdoors doing hard things. He was broad across the shoulders, dark-haired going to gray, and he had the particular watchfulness of someone who had learned to read rooms quickly, the habit of a man who had spent time in places where reading the room was the difference between trouble and worse trouble. He came to the Hart cabin on Saturday morning. Joe was already there. Frank was there. Sam and Rachel stood together on the porch, and whatever Calder felt when he saw them, he kept it below the surface because the only thing that showed on his face when he dismounted and looked up at the cabin was something that might have been recognition, the look of a man seeing a place that has been described to him and finding it both exactly what he expected and somehow nothing like what he was prepared for. The children were inside. Rachel had kept them inside deliberately, not hiding them, protecting the meeting from the weight of too many eyes. Except Eli. Eli was on the porch step, and Joe had not asked him to be there and had not told him to leave, because Eli, at 12 years old, had earned the right to stand where he chose to stand, and everyone present understood that. Calder stopped at the base of the porch steps. He looked at Sam. "Mr. Hart," he said. "Mr. Calder," Sam said. A pause that held 11 years of absence and all the questions that absence generates. Then Calder looked at the cabin, at the patched roof and the kitchen garden, and the sound just barely audible through the walls of children who were badly pretending not to be listening. "How many of them are Martha's?" he asked. 4, Rachel said. The others came to us separately. Calder's jaw moved. 4,
This story
he
was
said
posted
quietly.
on the channel west of
Thomas,
Betrayal.
who is 9.
Please do not
Lily, who is
repost
7.
it in any form.
The twins James and Nora, who just turned 5 last month. Rachel's voice was steady, precise. The voice of a woman who has introduced these children to officials and strangers and doctors, and has learned to do it in a way that neither diminishes them nor invites judgment. They are healthy and fed and learning their letters. Thomas has a gift for numbers. Lily hasn't stopped talking since she was 3. The twins are... A brief pause that held more warmth than the word could carry considerable. Calder looked at her for a long moment, then at Sam. She asked you to take them, he said. Martha. She did, Sam said. And you did. We did. Calder put his hands in his coat pockets. He looked at the ground, then back up. I got word she was sick, he said. Late. Too late to get back in time. He said it without excusing himself, without asking for absolution. Just the plain statement of a man who knew what he'd missed and wasn't going to dress it up. I should have been in contact long before that. Yes, Sam said. You should have. The bluntness of it landed visibly. Calder accepted it. I came back because I thought I had some idea that maybe I could... He stopped, started again. I came back because they're my blood. They are, Sam said. And we won't pretend otherwise. But they're also children who have had a home here for 4 years and a family not by blood, but by every other measure that counts. And whatever you decide your rights are in this situation, those two things both exist at the same time. Calder looked at Eli. Eli looked back at him with those dark, watchful eyes that missed nothing and forgave nothing quickly. You're not one of Martha's, Calder said to him. A statement not unkind. No, Eli said. Where did you come from? Train wreck, Eli said. 3 years ago. My parents were on it. He said it the way he said everything, flat and direct and entirely without the performance of suffering, because Eli had learned that his pain was his and he owed no one a demonstration of it. Sam and Rachel took me in. Calder looked at him for a long time. Then he looked at Joe. And you, he said. What's your stake in this? I'm a neighbor, Joe said. Calder's eyes said he didn't believe that was the whole answer. A neighbor who filed a legal partnership claim and is buying adjacent land. A neighbor, Joe repeated, who intends to make sure this household is still standing in 30 years. He met Calder's gaze. Whatever your intentions are here, Mr. Calder, I want to understand them clearly. Did you file that title challenge because you believe those children belong somewhere else, or did someone convince you that filing it was in your interest? The question landed hard. Calder's expression shifted, a tightening, a flicker of something that looked like anger directed not at Joe, but at himself. A man named Kent approached me, he said after a pause. 2 days after I arrived in town. He'd heard I was asking about the Hart property. He told me that the arrangement here was legally questionable, that the children might be better served with a blood relative making decisions for them, and that he could help me press that claim if I was willing to challenge the land transfer. He stopped. He made it sound like I'd be helping them. He made it sound like that, Joe said.
This story was
because
posted
it got
on the
him what
channel
he
west
wanted.
of Betrayal. Please do
Calder
not
looked at the
repost
cabin
it in
again,
any form.
at the garden, at the clean mended clothes on the line. He stood there for a long moment, in the way a man stands when he is calculating the distance between what he thought he was doing and what he was actually doing. Then he said, I'll withdraw the filing. Rachel let out a breath so small that only Sam standing beside her would have felt it. I want to see them, Calder said. Martha's children. I'm not asking for anything else right now. I just want to see them. Rachel looked at Sam. Sam looked at her. The conversation they had in that look was the kind that takes two people 12 years of shared mornings to learn to have in a single glance. Come in, Rachel said. Joe sat on the porch with Frank while Calder was inside. He could hear through the walls the sound of small voices, cautious at first, then less cautious, and Rachel's steady presence moving through the noise like a river current, directing and steadying without controlling. "You think he means it?" Frank asked. "The withdrawal." "I think he came here expecting to find something worth fighting for and found something worth protecting instead," Joe said. "Those are different things." "Kent won't let it go." "No," Joe said. "He won't." Frank leaned back in his chair. "Then what?" Joe had spent the last 24 hours with this question. He'd turned it over in every direction, tested it against every angle Kent might use, and come back to the same answer each time. "The only way to end it," he said, "is to remove the thing Kent's been using as leverage. The uncertainty, the informality, all the edges he can get his fingers into." He looked at Frank. "The partnership documents need to be completed this week. The Miller purchase needs to close. And I'm going to the county registrar on Monday to file a formal request for Sam and Rachel Hart to be recognized as a legal household of care under my co-sponsorship." He paused. "And I'm going to make sure every single piece of that is public record." Frank looked at him. "That exposes you." "Good," Joe said. "Let it expose me. Let everyone in this county know exactly where I stand and what I'm prepared to do. Kent's strategy only works in the dark. In the light, it's just a banker trying to bully an old couple, and people don't tend to admire that for long." Frank was quiet for a moment. "You know what you're doing changes things for you permanently." "Yes." "You won't be able to go back to being the man on 1,200 acres who doesn't get involved." "Frank," Joe said, "I don't want to go back to being that man." He looked at his hands. "That man was surviving, that's all, and I'd started to confuse surviving with living." He paused. "These people, Sam and Rachel, and those children, they reminded me what the difference feels like." Frank looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "Daniel would have liked it here." Joe's throat tightened. He let it. He didn't fight it the way he'd spent 11 years fighting it. "Yeah," he said. His voice came out rough at the edges. "He would have run those twins right into the ground trying to keep up with them." Frank smiled, quietly. The smile of a man who had known Daniel McKinney at 6 years old and was glad finally to say his name in a sentence that was about living instead of loss. Calder stayed for 2 hours. When he came out, Thomas was holding his hand with the easy confidence of a 9-year-old who has decided someone is trustworthy, and Lily was talking to him with the volume and velocity of a child who has been waiting her entire life for an audience and has no intention of wasting the opportunity. He crouched down on the porch step and talked to them at their level, and whatever he said made Thomas laugh and made Lily give him the particular look she gave people who had correctly identified what she found funny: pleased, surprised, cautiously, fond. He straightened up and looked at Sam. "I'd like to come back," he said. "If that's all right. Not to make claims. Just to know them." Sam looked at Rachel. Rachel looked at Calder with those clear gray eyes that assessed everything accurately. "You'll come for Sunday supper," she said. "Every week you're in town. You'll come to the table like everybody else, and you'll earn your place at it the same way everybody else does." "How's that?" Calder asked. "By showing up," Rachel said simply. Calder nodded. He looked at Joe on his way to his horse. "Kent told me you were a difficult man," he said. "Kent tells a lot of things," Joe said. "He said you'd lost your way after your boy died, and that the heart situation was you trying to buy your way back to feeling something." He paused. "I wanted you to know I don't think that's what this is." Joe looked at him for a moment. "Appreciate that." Calder mounted and rode out, and Lily waved at him until he was entirely out of sight, and Thomas watched from the porch with the quiet satisfaction of a boy who has just added something to his world that he hadn't known was missing. Warren Kent made one more move. It came on Tuesday, 3 days after Calder withdrew the title challenge in the form of a letter delivered to Joe's ranch by a boy who clearly didn't know what he was carrying. The letter was short. It said that Kent had acquired through a separate transaction
This
a
story
small
was
parcel
posted
of
on the
road
channel
access
west of
land
Betrayal.
between the Hart
Please
property
do not
and the
repost
main
it
county
in any
road,
form.
and that he intended to exercise his rights over that access in ways that would make the Hart household considerably less convenient to maintain. Joe read it twice. Then he went to Frank. Frank read it once. "He's going to blockade the road access," he said. "He's going to try," Joe said. "He can't hold it legally for long, but he can hold it long enough to make a point and make things difficult for a family that's already managing Rachel's health and 12 children." He folded the letter. "So we're going to remove the point." "How?" "I'm going to buy it from him," Joe said. "Today. Whatever he paid for it, I'll pay him double, and I'll take the deed in my own name. And I'll deed it to the county as a public road in perpetuity, so that no one, not Kent, not anyone, can ever close it again." He paused. "And I'm going to walk into his office and make him take the money in person." Frank looked at him. "He'll hate that." "I'm counting on it," Joe said. "So, Kent took the money. He took it because refusing it would have meant refusing more than twice what he'd paid, which no amount of pride could justify to a man of his particular financial sensibility, and because Joe had brought Frank and Joe's lawyer to the transaction, and the whole thing was witnessed and documented before Kent could find a reason to complicate it. He signed the deed transfer without looking at Joe. Joe thanked him with genuine courtesy, because the purpose of the moment was not to humiliate Kent, but to end the game, and prolonging it for satisfaction's sake was the kind of thing a smaller man did. Joe was done being smaller than the situation required. He walked out of Kent's office for the second, and he suspected final time. He did not look back. The partnership documents were signed on Friday afternoon at the ranch with Frank and Clara as witnesses, and the Hart children, distributed across the kitchen and front room, in various states of attempted stillness that fooled nobody. Sam signed his name with the careful precision of a man who understood what he was putting his name to. Rachel signed beside him with the brisk efficiency of someone who had been waiting for this paperwork to exist for 12 years and was glad to be done waiting. Joe signed last. Eli was standing in the doorway when Joe set down the pen. The boy had been there the whole time, not fidgeting, not asking questions, just watching with those dark eyes that observed everything and revealed only what they chose to. "You're staying," Eli said. Not a question this time. Joe looked at him. "I'm staying." "For good." "For good," Joe said. Eli looked at him for a long moment with the full weight of everything that phrase meant to a boy who had arrived at this house from a train wreck and had spent 3 years watching adults mean things until they didn't anymore. Then he crossed the room, sat down in the chair next to Joe, and picked up the pen. "Can I sign too?" he asked. There was no legal reason to include him. There was every human reason to. Joe slid the document toward him. "Sign right there," he said. Eli signed his name in the careful, deliberate letters of a boy who had learned to write in that very kitchen under Clara's instruction on a slate that Rachel had bought with money she didn't have, because she believed that knowing how to write your own name was the first thing a person needed before they could claim anything else. He set the pen down and looked at what he'd written. Then he looked up at Joe, and for the first time since the Tuesday morning when Joe had first walked into the Hart cabin, and Eli had looked him
This
over like
story
a
was
cautious,
posted on the
watchful
channel
animal
west of
deciding whether a
Betrayal.
new thing was
Please
safe,
do not
the
repost
tension
it
around
in
the
any
boy's
form.
eyes was simply gone. Not lowered, not managed. Gone. "Okay," Eli said in the tone of a boy who has concluded a very long internal deliberation and arrived at a verdict. "Okay." Rachel put food on the table. Frank told a story about something that had happened in his ride from Helena that made 3 of the younger children laugh so hard, one of them fell off their chair. Calder arrived at the door at exactly supper time, hat in hand, with a paper-wrapped bundle that turned out to be peppermint candy, which immediately elevated his standing with Lily to something approaching reverence. Sam sat at the head of his table, the table in the house that was now on paper, and in every other way that counted permanently and irrevocably his, and looked around the room with the quiet, steady face of a man who has spent 12 years building something and has just for the first time allowed himself to believe it will last. Joe sat among all of it. The noise and the warmth, and the specific, irreplaceable texture of a house that is full, not just of people, but of the kind of life that happens when people choose each other deliberately and repeatedly, even when it costs something. He thought of his own house. 4 rooms, a kitchen with a proper stove, a bedroom too big for one man. He thought that it might be time to do something about that. After supper, when the younger children were in bed, and the older ones were settled, and Sam was on the porch with Frank, and the summer dark was warm and full of the sounds of a valley that had been going about its business long before any of them arrived, and would continue long after Rachel came and sat beside Joe at the kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee, and the particular quality of presence that meant she had something to say and was deciding how to say it. "You came here in June," she said, "looking for something to do with yourself." "I came here to get my fence fixed," Joe said. Rachel looked at him over her cup with those clear gray eyes. "Joseph McKinney," she said. "Don't do that." He almost smiled. "No, ma'am." "You came here because you'd been alone long enough, and something in you knew it." She set down her cup. "And you found us, and we found you, and now here we are." She paused. "Daniel would be proud of who you're becoming." Joe looked at the table. His throat did what it did. He let it. "You didn't know him," he said. "No," Rachel said gently. "But I know you, and I can read what he left in you well enough." She put her hand over his, briefly one firm, warm, entirely maternal gesture that lasted exactly as long as it needed to, and not a moment more. "He's not gone, Joe. He's just ahead of you, waiting to see what you do with the rest of it." Joe sat with that for a long time. The coffee cooled. The house breathed around him. Outside, Sam laughed at something Frank said, a low reel sound that carried all the way through the walls, and somewhere in the back room, one of the twins called out in sleep, and then went quiet again, soothed by whatever peace surrounded them. Joe McKinney had come to Harlan Creek 11 years ago with grief and money and 1,200 acres, and the absolute conviction that what he'd lost could never be replaced, only survived. He had been right about the loss. He had been wrong about the surviving, because surviving and living were different things, and the difference was this: a table with food on it. A boy who'd signed his name on a document that meant someone was staying a woman whose coffee was always hot before he asked for it. A man who sharpened blades with long, even strokes and said hard things plainly and meant every word. This was what remained when a man finally stopped running from what he loved. This was what home cost, and what it gave back, and how it lasted. Joe picked up his coffee cup, looked around the kitchen of a house that was not his, and was entirely his in every way that mattered, and understood clearly finally, without reservation, that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. And he was never going to leave.